The arrow took the near ox in the flank before Elijah Monroe even heard the bowstring, and after that, everything happened too fast for thought. The ox screamed and lurched sideways, the wagon tongue snapping half in two, and the whole cart tipped hard enough to spill a dozen sacks of grain into the mud of the border road. Elijah went down with them, rolling clear of the wheel by instinct more than skill, and came up with his skinning knife already in his hand, though against 6 raiders on horseback, a skinning knife was worth about as much as a prayer. "Leave the flour," one of the raiders shouted, though they clearly meant to leave nothing at all. They were men, not orcs, hard-eyed deserters and road bandits who had learned that a lone Cartwright hauling goods toward orc territory was too poor to have soldiers guarding him and too desperate to have anyone else care if he died on this stretch of road. Elijah backed against the broken wagon, put himself between the raiders and the terrified second ox, and said, in the calmest voice he could manage, "Take the flour. Take the salt pork. Just let the ox go." He did not expect them to listen. He expected the club that was already swinging for his skull. He did not expect the sound that came next, a war cry that seemed to split the morning in half, followed by the drumming of hooves that did not belong to the raiders' horses. She came out of the tree line like something poured from old stories, riding low over a heavy gray warhorse with a spear in one hand, and Elijah's first true look at Yash Mudborn was of her leaning nearly sideways off her saddle to drive the butt of that spear into a raider's chest, so hard the man left his stirrups entirely. She wore fitted warrior's leathers dyed the deep green-brown of pine bark, laced tight up the sides to move with her rather than against her, a hard leather cuirass molded close over her body, and belted at a waist that was narrow only by comparison to the powerful width of her shoulders. Her arms were bare from the shoulder down, corded with muscle, marked here and there with old pale scars and the dark painted lines of clan marks. Her skin was a deep mossy green, and her black hair was pulled back in a thick braid that swung like a whip as she turned her horse. Tusks, not over-large, showed white at the corners of a mouth that was, in this particular moment, pulled into a snarl of pure fury. She was, without any competition Elijah could think of, the most striking person he had ever laid eyes on. 2 more riders followed her, orcs in matching leather harness with the same clan marks, and between the 3 of them the fight lasted less than a minute. 1 raider fled outright. 2 others went down under spear and axe. The rest scattered into the trees, and Yash Mudborn did not chase them. She wheeled her horse instead and looked down at Elijah as if she had only just remembered he was there. "You are bleeding," she said. Her voice was low, rough at the edges, and carried an accent that turned certain words hard as stones. Elijah touched his own temple and found blood there, though he had no memory of being struck. "Must have caught something when the cart went over." "You stood in front of an ox," she said, and there was something almost like disbelief in it. "Against 6 men. For an ox." "He didn't do anything to deserve dying for my flour," Elijah said. She stared at him a long moment, green eyes sharp under a heavy brow, and something in her face shifted, though he could not yet read what it was. Then she swung down off her horse in one smooth motion and crossed to him, and up close she was even taller than she had looked from the ground, taller than him by half a head, and twice as broad through the shoulder. "You are the Cartwright," she said. "The one from Fenwick Crossing who brings the grain shipments." "Elijah Monroe," he said, and offered his hand before he remembered that orcs did not, as a rule, shake hands with humans on this side of the border. She looked at his offered hand for a moment, then took it in a grip that could have crushed stone, and did not let go quite as quickly as courtesy required. "Yash Mudborn," she said, "guard captain of Ashroot Camp. You will need an escort the rest of the way in, and someone to look at that wound before it festers. It's a scratch." "It is my road," she said, in the tone of someone accustomed to having the last word, "and I decide what is a scratch on it." That was how it began, not with courtship, not with softness, but with an orc war captain deciding, in the space of a few minutes on a blood-spattered road, that the human Cartwright bleeding in the mud was hers to look after. Elijah did not know it yet, but she had already decided several other things as well, and would spend the following months proving every one of them true. Fenwick Crossing sat where the wagon road met the river ford, the last true human town before the land climbed up into the Cragmore Reach, and everyone in it knew Elijah Monroe as the fool who hauled supplies into Orc territory when no one else would take the contract. He had inherited the wagon, the 2 oxen, and the debts from his father, along with a small cabin on the town's ragged edge, and a reputation for being a man who kept to himself. He had no wife, no family left living, and precious few friends who did more than nod at him in passing. He liked the deep wild better than he liked most people anyway, and years of hunting and tracking through the mountains before he'd taken up his father's cart trade had taught him to read a broken branch or a half-print in mud better than he read most human faces. The town's minister had told him once, not unkindly, that a man who spent so much time alone and so much time among orcs would forget how to be among his own kind. Elijah had not argued. He suspected it was already true. He delivered to Ashroot Camp because the pay was steady, and because, if he was honest with himself in the dark of his cabin at night, he did not entirely believe the things the town said about orcs. He had seen orc hunting parties pass through the deep wild on his own tracking trips over the years, had once watched from cover as an orc mother taught her cub to track a deer with more patience than most human fathers showed their sons, and had never once been troubled by them. Prejudice, he had decided long ago, was mostly a disease of people who had never had to look past their own fear. He had not expected, on his first supply run after the ambush, for Yash Mudbourne to be waiting for him at the camp's outer stockade with her arms crossed and an expression that dared him to be injured again. "The wound," she said, before he had even brought the wagon to a full stop, "has healed clean." "Good, you've been thinking about my scratch." "I think about many things," she said, and there was the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth that might, on a less formidable woman, have been called a smile. "Come. The chief wants the grain counted before dark, and I want to know if a man who stands in front of oxen for bandits is fool enough to also be useful with a bow." That first delivery, meant to take an afternoon, took 3 days. Yash found reasons. A supply cart's axle needed checking by someone who understood human wagons. A hunting party had gone missing in the ravines to the north, and needed a tracker who could read sign the way the camp's own scouts, trained for open ground and war, sometimes could not. The chief wanted a report, delayed, on trade prices in Fenwick Crossing that only the Cartwright himself could give. Each reason was true enough on its own. Together, they added up to something Elijah recognized, with a mixture of alarm and pleasure he did not examine too closely, as a woman finding excuses to keep him near. He did not mind, that was the trouble. The lost hunting party turned out to be 4 young orcs, barely past their first blooding, who had followed a wounded elk too deep into a ravine system and gotten themselves cliffed out on a ledge with a broken leg among them and a pack of mountain wolves circling below. Yash's own scouts had searched half a day and found nothing. Elijah found the trail in under an hour, reading broken lichen on stone and a single strand of leather cording caught on a thorn bush, and led a rescue party up through a goat track that made even Yash's hardened warriors go pale. He went down over the ledge himself on a rope of braided hide, because he weighed less than any of the orcs and the ledge would not hold a heavier man safely, and he set the broken leg with the same careful hands he'd once used to splint his father's fingers after a wagon accident, murmuring low reassurances to a frightened young orc who did not speak much of the human tongue, but understood, well enough, the steadiness of a man who was not afraid to be gentle. When he came back up over the lip of the ravine, soaked in sweat and shaking faintly from the climb, Yash was waiting for him at the top, and she did not say anything at first. She simply looked at him for a long moment, and then reached out and put her broad hand against the side of his face, thumb brushing along his jaw in a gesture that was somewhere between checking him for injury and something far less practical. "You went down that rope for children who are not even your own kind," she said. "They're somebody's kin," Elijah said. "That was enough." Among my people, Yash said slowly, there is a saying, a warrior's worth is not measured by what they will kill. It is measured by what they will climb down a cliff for. She let her hand fall, though reluctantly, he thought. You are, Cartwright, an unusual man. You keep finding reasons for me to stay another day, he said, because he had decided, somewhere on that ledge with a frightened orc boy's hand gripping his, that he was done pretending not to notice. I'd like to know if that's the camp's need, Captain Mudbourne, or yours. Something flared in her eyes, sharp and hot, and for one heartbeat he thought he had gone too far, spoken too plainly to a woman who commanded warriors and could break him in half without much effort. Then she laughed, low and startled, as if the sound had escaped before she meant to allow it. Mine, she said. It has been mine since you stood in front of an ox and called it worth dying for. Does that trouble you? No, Elijah said, and found that it was entirely true. It doesn't trouble me at all. The camp itself was nothing like the raiding grounds and blood-soaked battlefields the stories back in Fenwick Crossing liked to imagine. Ashroot Camp spread along a river terrace beneath the shoulder of the mountains, a sprawl of hide tents and timber longhouses arranged in wide circles around central fire pits, with pens for goats and horses, drying racks hung with meat and hide, and orc children, quick and sharp-eyed, chasing each other between the tent lines with wooden practice spears. There was laughter here, and arguments over dice, and old warriors telling stories by the fire that made younger ones groan and roll their eyes exactly the way young people did everywhere. There was also suspicion, plenty of it, aimed at Elijah every time he walked the tent rows. Some of it eased with time, as the camp grew used to the sight of the human Cartwright hauling grain and salt and iron nails, always polite, always quick to help wherever a hand was needed, whether that meant repairing a cracked wagon wheel for an old woman or teaching a group of curious cubs how to set a snare line the way his own father had once taught him. Some of the suspicion did not ease at all and belonged mostly to one orc, Threk Ironjaw, second captain of the camp guard, a broad, scarred warrior who had, Elijah gathered from careful listening, once hoped to be more than a fellow captain to Yash Mudbourne. She wastes her attention on you, Threk told him bluntly, one evening outside the supply tent, arms crossed over a chest like a barrel. A human, a cart driver. She could have any warrior in this camp, and she spends her evenings teaching you our tongue instead. She's teaching me because I asked her to, Elijah said evenly. Seemed a poor sort of guest who couldn't learn to say thank you properly in the language of the people feeding him. Threk's lip curled back from a tusk. Do not mistake her kindness for weakness, Cartwright. Yash Mudbourne does not choose easily. When she chooses, it is a mountain falling. You are not built to stand under a mountain. Elijah thought about that a long while after, alone in the small guest tent Yash had ordered set up for him near her own, the same tent that somehow, delivery after delivery, never seemed to get taken down between his visits. He thought about it while lying awake listening to the distant sound of drums and low singing from the central fire, about the fact that a woman who could crush stone with her bare grip had also spent an hour that very evening carefully teaching him the proper way to say I am grateful for your hospitality in her own tongue, correcting his pronunciation with a patience that did not match anything Threk Ironjaw's warning implied about mountains falling. He was not built to stand under a mountain, perhaps. But he found, lying there in the dark, that he wanted to try anyway. It happened on the fourth delivery, nearly 2 months after the ambush on the road, on an evening when Yash had once again found a reason. This time, a genuinely thin one, a supply count that could easily have waited until morning, to keep him at the camp past dark. They sat together at the edge of the river, away from the central fires, close enough to hear the drums and laughter but far enough to have a quiet that belonged only to them. Yash had brought a skin of something sharp and smoky that burned pleasantly going down, and Elijah had brought, of all things, a small carved wooden fox he'd whittled during slow evenings on the road, meant as a gift for no one in particular until this exact moment presented itself. For you, he said, feeling suddenly foolish, and put it into her broad palm. Foxes are clever and quick, and they don't back down from much bigger animals when they have to protect what's theirs. Made me think of you. Yash turned the little carving over in her fingers, tracing the lines of it with a care that seemed strange coming from hands that could snap a spear halved in two. You made this. On the road. Nothing much. No one has given me a gift like this, she said quietly. Warriors give me weapons. Elders give me duties. No one has given me a small, clever fox because it reminded them of me. She looked up at him, and the firelight from the distant camp caught the green of her eyes and made them glow like something out of the old stories his father used to tell. Elijah Monroe. Do you know what it means among my people for a guard captain to keep extending a man's stay, delivery after delivery, month after month? I've had my suspicions, he admitted. It means, she said, setting the fox down carefully in the grass beside her, that I have been courting you. Slowly. Like a coward, because you are human, and because I did not know if you would want a woman who could break you if she were careless. Her hand came up, and this time it did not stop at his jaw. She drew him toward her, slow enough to give him every chance to pull away, and he did not pull away at all. I am not being careless now. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like he'd imagined a kiss from a woman built like a war horse might be. It was careful and hungry both at once, her hand cradling the back of his head as though he were something precious rather than something breakable, and when she finally drew back, she rested her forehead against his and let out a breath that shook, just slightly, for a woman who commanded warriors and feared nothing. I have wanted to do that since you climbed down a cliff for 4 foolish cubs, she admitted. I have wanted you to do that since you nearly knocked a man off his horse defending my ox, Elijah said, and felt her laugh more than heard it, a low rumble against his chest as she pulled him close. Stay through tomorrow, she said against his hair. You said that yesterday. I will say it again tomorrow, Yash Mudbourne said, and the day after that, and I do not intend to stop saying it, Cartwright, until you understand that I mean for you to simply stay. It was 3 weeks later, on a delivery that had turned, as they so often did now, into a week-long stay, that Yash first saw the medallion. Elijah wore it always, tucked beneath his shirt on a leather cord, a battered bronze disc, worn nearly smooth by decades of handling, stamped with a design he had never been able to fully make out, something like 2 hands clasped around a broken circle. His father had given it to him on his deathbed, told him only that it had come down through the family for 3 generations, from a great-grandfather who had served as a negotiator in the old border wars and never spoke of what he'd seen there. Elijah had always assumed it was simple superstition, an old soldier's lucky charm, and wore it now mostly because it was the last thing his father had ever pressed into his hand. He had never thought to show it to anyone at Ashroot Camp. It was Yash, drowsing against his shoulder by the fire one evening with her fingers idly tracing the collar of his shirt, who found the cord and drew the medallion out into the firelight, and went very still. Where did you get this? She said. Her voice had changed entirely, gone hard and low in a way he had never heard from her. It was my father's, his father's before that. Family heirloom is all I ever knew of it. He sat up straighter, alarmed by the change in her. Yash, what is it? She did not answer right away. Instead she rose, crossed to her own tent, and came back with a small locked chest he had never seen opened, from which she drew a second piece of bronze, tarnished nearly black, stamped with the mirror half of the same broken circle. When she held the 2 pieces together in her palm, the design resolved into a single unbroken image, 2 hands, human and orc, clasped around a full sun. This, she said quietly, is the other half of the Blackwater Oath token. It has been kept in this camp, guarded, unable to be reunited with its match for 30 years. Since the massacre at Blackwater Ford, when the truce your ancestors and mine swore to was broken in blood, and the shaman who died there cursed both bloodlines with her last breath because the peace could not be completed. She looked up at him, and there was something almost like grief in her face now, tangled with disbelief. Elijah. What was your great-grandfather's name? His mouth had gone dry. Aldous Monroe. Yash closed her eyes. Ancestors watch over us, she murmured. You are his blood, the negotiator who fled Blackwater Ford with the human half of the token and was never seen in these lands again. I don't understand, Elijah said, though a cold weight was already settling in his stomach. What curse? What massacre? Nobody in Fenwick Crossing ever spoke of this. Of course they did not, Yash said, bitter now. It is not a story that flatters your people. 30 years ago, at a place called Blackwater Ford, my clan's elders met with human negotiators, your great-grandfather among them, to end the border wars with a true peace. A token was made, split in two, one half for each side to be reunited when the treaty was signed and sealed by both chiefs. Before the ink dried, a militia band that answered to no commander fell upon the meeting under cover of dark and slaughtered half the orc elders present, including our clan shaman. Your great-grandfather did not lead that slaughter, but he fled with his half of the token rather than stay and see the peace finished, rather than face what his own kind had done. And the shaman, dying, bound both halves and both bloodlines with her last words, that neither side would know true peace nor a fully unbroken line until the token was reunited at the place it was broken. And since then, Yash said, my clan has been unable to leave the Cragmore Reach for more than a season without sickness falling upon our warriors. Our chief, Borek Skarn, grows weaker every year with no wound and no illness a healer can name. Our crops fail more often than they should. We have called it the old debt for 3 decades, and told our young ones it was simply misfortune, because what good does it do to curse a boy with his ancestors' sins? She reached out and took Elijah's hand, turning it over gently, as though the medallion's weight had somehow transferred itself into his palm. And now that boy has walked into my camp of his own will and fallen in love with its guard captain, and worn his ancestors' half of the broken oath around his neck the entire time, none of us ever imagining. Yash. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. If your people find out who I am, what my blood did to this camp. They will find out, she said grimly, because I will not lie about it and because that medallion cannot stay hidden now that I know what it is. But hear me, Elijah Monroe. She took his face in both her broad hands, forced his eyes to hers. You did not break that truce. You were not born when Blackwater Ford burned. Whatever comes of this, I do not blame you, and I will not allow this camp to blame you either. He wanted to believe her. He would learn within 2 days exactly how much that promise would cost her to keep. The council fire at Ashroot Camp was called the evening after Yash brought the 2 halves of the token before Chief Borek Skarn, and word of what the human Cartwright carried around his neck spread through the camp faster than any wildfire. By the time the sun went down, nearly the entire camp had gathered in a wide ring around the central fire pit, orcs of every age standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit orange and shifting in the firelight. And the mood among them was not one Elijah had ever wanted to stand at the center of. Chief Borek Skarn sat upon a low stone seat near the fire, an old orc gone gray at the temples, his broad frame diminished by 30 years of a slow, wasting sickness that no healer's poultice had ever touched. Beside him stood Threk Ironjaw, arms crossed, his expression carrying no surprise at all, only a grim satisfaction that made Elijah's skin crawl. The Cartwright, Threk announced to the gathered camp before the chief could speak, carries the blood of Aldous Monroe. The very man who fled Blackwater Ford with our elders' murder still wet on the ground, and left our clan to rot beneath a shaman's dying curse for 30 years. He has walked among us, eaten our food, been welcomed at our fires, and all the while his blood is the reason our chief withers before our eyes. A low, ugly murmur went through the crowd. Elijah stood very straight, his hand not quite touching the medallion at his throat, and did not look away from any of the eyes fixed on him. He did not do this, Yash said, stepping forward to stand beside him, her voice pitched to carry over the whole gathering. He was not born when the Ford burned. He has spent months proving himself worthy of this camp's trust, and I will not see him blamed for a dead man's cowardice." "The curse does not care whose fault it is," Threk shot back. "The shaman bound the bloodlines, not the men. Elder Gask has said it plainly. The only certain way to lift the debt without the full ritual at Blackwater Ford itself is a blood price paid by the bloodline that broke the peace. His blood, Captain Mudbourne, spilled before this fire for our chief's life." The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to agreement, voices rising, old grievances 30 years buried finding new air, and Elijah felt, for the first time since he had walked into Ashroot Camp, the true weight of being one man surrounded by a people who had every reason in the world to hate what his blood represented. He did not reach for a weapon. There would have been no point, and worse, it would have proven every fear Threk was stoking. He simply stood and waited and hoped that whatever came next, it would not cost Yash anything she could not afford to lose. What came next was nothing he could have predicted. Yash Mudbourne drew the long hunting knife from her belt, and before anyone in the gathered crowd could react, she drew its edge across her own palm, opening a shallow line of dark green blood, and held her hand out toward Elijah. "Hear me," she said, and her voice cracked across the assembled camp like a whip. "By the old right of claiming before this fire and this chief and every warrior of Ashroot Camp as witness, I claim this man as mine, not guest, not visitor, mine, bound by blood and by choice, under the law that has stood since before Blackwater Ford was ever burned. Any blood price owed by his line is now owed to my line as well, for what touches him now touches Yash Mudbourne, and any who would spill his blood must first spill mine to reach it." The entire camp went utterly silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Elijah stared at her outstretched, bleeding palm, understanding perhaps a third of what she had just said in the old tongue, but understanding, with total clarity, the shape of what she had done. She had stood in front of him the way he had once stood in front of an ox, and staked her own life and standing on the line to do it, in front of every single person whose good opinion she had spent a lifetime earning. "Yash," he said quietly, "you don't have to. I know what I do not have to do," she said, not looking away from the crowd. "This is what I choose to do. Take my hand, Cartwright, or tell this whole camp you do not want it, and let us both live with whichever answer you give." There was no version of himself that would ever give the second answer. Elijah drew his own knife, cut a shallow line across his palm with a hand that did not shake nearly as much as he expected it to, and clasped his bleeding hand to hers. The old orcs in the crowd, and there were a few, gray-haired and solemn, recognized the rite for what it was, and Elijah heard, over the roaring silence, one old woman near the front say something in a hushed, almost reverent tone that he would later learn meant, "The mountain has chosen." Threk Ironjaw's face went through several colors before settling on a dark, furious red. "This changes nothing," he snarled. "The blood price is still owed." "Then you will answer to me for collecting it," Yash said, turning on him with a cold fury that made even the massive second captain take half a step back. "I have claimed him under the old right. If you dispute my claim, Threk Ironjaw, you know the way that dispute is settled. Challenge me before this fire, here and now, or hold your tongue about spilling his blood for the rest of your days." Threk's jaw worked. Whatever he might have wanted to say, every eye in the camp was on him now, weighing him against a captain who had just staked her life on a claim in front of the whole clan, and against a chief who was watching with an unreadable, assessing gaze that suggested he, at least, understood exactly what kind of woman his second captain had just made an enemy of. "I do not challenge a blood claim made in grief for our chief's health," Threk said finally, each word dragged out like a tooth. "But the debt remains, Captain. Claim him all you like. It does not lift the curse from Chief Scarn, and it does not undo 30 years of Blackwater Ford." "No," Yash agreed and turned to look at the chief directly. "It does not. But it does mean that any road taken to lift it, my chief, will be walked by the two of us together. If the debt requires the reunited token brought back to Blackwater Ford itself, as the old lore says, then I will carry it there myself, with the last blood of Aldous Munro walking free and unharmed at my side, and we will end this the way it should have ended 30 years ago, with peace completed, not blood spilled again." Chief Borek Skarn was quiet for a long moment, his tired eyes moving between Yash's fierce, unbending stance and Elijah's steady, unflinching one. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin with illness but carried an old authority that silenced even Threk's simmering anger. "Blackwater Ford," the chief said slowly, "is 8 days' hard travel through the Greyfang Pass, in country neither clean nor safe for orc or human alone. The old shaman's binding said the token must be reunited there, whole before the next full turning of the moon, or the chance is lost for another generation, and I will not live to see a second chance." He looked at Yash. "You would spend 8 days on the road, risking your captaincy and your life, for a debt that is not truly yours to pay." "He is mine," Yash said simply. "That makes the debt mine as well." "I am asking your leave to go, Chief Skarn. I am not asking your permission to love him. That I have already decided." The old chief's mouth twitched, something almost like a smile breaking through 30 years of pain. "Then go, Captain Mudbourne, with my blessing and my hope. Bring back peace, or bring back nothing at all, but bring yourself home whole if the ancestors allow it." They left Ashroot Camp 2 mornings later, before full light, with 2 sturdy horses, enough provisions for the road, both halves of the oath token wrapped in oiled cloth and carried in a leather satchel at Yash's hip, and the uneasy knowledge that 8 days through the Greyfang Pass in threatening weather, with a curse's deadline hanging over their heads, was not a journey either of them could afford to take lightly. Fenwick Crossing lay on their route, the fastest way through toward the pass roads, and Elijah had hoped, foolishly, he would admit later that they might pass through quietly, buy a few last supplies and be gone before anyone took much notice. He should have known better. A Cartwright riding beside an orc war captain, both of them bloodied at the palm in a way that marked them clearly to anyone who knew what to look for, was never going to pass through his own hometown unnoticed. They were most of the way through the market square, past the stalls and the well, when old Garrett Pell, who ran the town's feed store and had known Elijah's father, stepped directly into their path with 3 other men behind him, all of them carrying the kind of tools that were not quite weapons but could certainly be used as such. "Elijah Munro," Garrett said, loud enough to draw every eye in the square. "You bring one of them into our town now. After everything the orcs have done to good folk on this border." "She's not here to hurt anyone, Garrett," Elijah said, keeping his voice level even as the crowd began to gather, drawn by the promise of a scene the way crowds always were. "She's ma—" He hesitated only for a moment, then found he did not want to hesitate at all. "She's mine and I'm hers, and we're passing through on urgent business that's none of yours." "Your business," said one of the other men, younger, angrier, "is bringing an orc raider into a town full of women and children." Yash's hand did not go to her weapon. Instead, deliberately, slowly, she swung down off her horse and stood in the open square in front of the whole gathered crowd, unarmed hands visible, and let them look at her really look, rather than at the shape of fear they'd built up in their minds. "I am not here to raid your town," she said, her accented voice carrying clearly across the square. "I am here because your neighbor stood in front of 6 armed men to protect an ox that was not even his own, and because he has spent months proving to my people, one small kindness at a time, that not every human shares the sins of the men who broke a peace 30 years before he was born. If you wish to judge him for loving me, judge him. But do not pretend it makes you safer to hate a woman who has done this town no harm." The square was quiet for a long, taut moment. It was Elijah who broke it, stepping down from his own horse to stand beside her, deliberately closing the distance between them in front of the whole crowd, taking her scarred, bloodied hand in his. "I've hauled supplies to that camp for 2 years, he said to the gathered townsfolk, to Garrett Pell specifically, whom he had known since childhood. "I've seen more decency there than I've seen prejudice here today. I'm not asking you to love her, Garrett. I'm asking you to let two people pass who have a debt to settle that's older than either of us, and more dangerous than anything standing in this square." It was not forgiveness, not exactly. Elijah did not expect that, not in a single confrontation, not from a town that had nursed its fears for 30 years. But Garrett Pell, after a long look between the two of them and the visible, matching cuts on their palms, finally stepped aside, and after a moment the men behind him did the same. "Go on then," Garrett said gruffly. "Settle your business. Don't bring trouble back to this town when you're done." "That," Yash murmured, low enough for only Elijah to hear as they remounted, "is the closest thing to a blessing your people have given me yet." "It's a start," Elijah said, and did not let go of her hand until the road forced him to. The Greyfang Pass did not care about curses or blood claims or the fragile beginnings of peace between two peoples. It offered them, over the following 6 days, every hardship a mountain wilderness could throw at two travelers with a deadline. A sudden hailstorm that forced them to shelter for half a day beneath an overhang, while Elijah kept both horses calm with the same low, steady voice he'd once used on a frightened orc boy on a cliff ledge. A washed-out section of trail that required Elijah's tracking eye to find a safe alternate route along a game trail invisible to anyone who did not know how to read broken brush and disturbed stone. And on the 4th night, a pack of true mountain wolves, starving and bold with the coming winter, that circled their camp in the dark until Yash drove them off with fire and spear and a roar that Elijah suspected could be heard clear back at Ashroot Camp. It was after the wolves, with both of them breathing hard by the dying fire, adrenaline still sharp in their blood, that Yash pulled him close without a word and kissed him with a hunger that had nothing careful left in it at all. "I have led war bands through worse country than this," she murmured against his mouth, "and never once feared for anything the way I feared tonight, watching a wolf come within a spear's length of you." "I had you," Elijah said. "Wasn't much room left over for fear." "Careful, Cartwright," she said, though her voice had gone rough and warm. "Keep saying things like that, and I will forget we have a curse to break before the moon turns." "Maybe the curse can wait an hour," he said, and found, from the way she laughed low against his throat and drew him down beside the fire, that she agreed entirely. Their intimacy, when it came fully that night beneath the wide mountain sky, was not something either of them rushed toward lightly. It carried the weight of every stolen glance since the road ambush, every extended stay, every excuse she had invented to keep him near her fire one more evening. It was tender in ways her fearsome reputation gave no hint of, her powerful hands astonishingly gentle against him, and it was fierce in ways his quiet, solitary life had never prepared him to expect, her voice murmuring low endearments in her own tongue against his skin that he did not need translated to understand. When it was over, she held him against her chest with an arm heavy enough to anchor him to the earth, and murmured, half into his hair, that she had never in her life expected to want to keep anyone the way she wanted to keep him. "Then keep me," Elijah said, drowsy and content in a way he had not felt since before his father died. "I'm not fighting you on it." "Good," Yash said, "because I do not intend to stop." On the 6th day they crossed the last high shoulder of the pass and began the descent toward the valley where Blackwater Ford waited, and it was there, coming down a narrow switchback trail with the ruined watchtower already visible far below like a broken tooth against the gray sky, that Threk Ironjaw caught up to them. He had followed alone, driving his horse hard through the pass on a route Elijah's tracking eye recognized, even at a distance, as recklessly dangerous. The kind of shortcut a man took only when driven by something stronger than good sense. "You did not think I would let this go," Threk called out, reining in below them on the trail, blocking the narrow path with his horse's bulk. "The chief's blessing does not erase 30 years, Captain. If the ritual fails, if his blood is not enough to complete what the shaman demanded, I will not let you throw away your life on false hope. The ritual requires the token reunited at the ford, not blood spilled," Yash snapped. "You know the old lore as well as I do, Threk." You simply prefer the version that lets you hate him. I prefer the version, Threx said, where you are not throwing away everything you have built, your rank, your honor, the respect of the whole camp, on a human who will be dead of old age before you have lived half your years. Do you understand what you are giving up for him, Yash? Everything, Yash said, without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt in her voice. I understand it entirely, Threk Ironjaw, and I would give it again tomorrow and every day after that. Threk's face twisted, some old grief finally surfacing beneath the anger. I wanted to be the one you said that about. I know, Yash said, more gently than Elijah had ever heard her speak to the man. You are a good captain, and you would have made a good match for someone. But my heart does not answer to duty or to what makes sense, Threk. It answers to him. Let us pass. Let this end the way it should have ended 30 years ago, and go home to tell the chief that the debt is finally paid. For a long moment, on that narrow mountain trail with a drop falling away on one side and a wall of stone rising on the other, Elijah genuinely did not know which way Threk Ironjaw would choose. Then the big orc let out a breath that seemed to carry 30 years of frustration with it, and moved his horse aside, clearing the trail. If it fails, Threk said, I will be the one to carry the news to the chief. Do not make me carry news of your death instead. I do not intend to die today, Yash said, and nudged her horse forward past him, Elijah following close behind, both of them keenly aware of the second captain watching them go with an expression that was, for the first time since Elijah had met him, more sorrow than hate. Blackwater Ford, when they reached it in the fading light of the 6th evening, was a haunted sort of place. A wide, shallow river crossing overlooked by the crumbling remains of a stone watchtower, its walls scorched black in places that 30 years of weather had never fully scoured clean. Elijah could feel it the moment they rode into the clearing, a heaviness in the air, a wrongness that had nothing to do with the coming dusk, as though the ground itself remembered what had happened here and had never quite let it go. This is where it happened, Yash said quietly, dismounting near the ruined base of the tower. Where the elders met, where my clan's shaman died cursing both our bloodlines with her final breath. They made camp within sight of the tower rather than inside its broken walls, both of them unwilling, without needing to discuss it, to spend the coming night any closer to the site of old grief than necessary. The ritual, according to what lore the camp's elder had been able to pass down through Yash before they left, needed to be performed at dawn, when the first light touched the ford, the same hour, 30 years before, that the peace had been meant to be sealed before the militia's arrows turned celebration into slaughter. Neither of them slept well that night. Elijah lay awake listening to the river's low murmur, Yash's arm heavy and warm across his chest, and found himself thinking not of curses or ancient debts, but of the simple, staggering fact that a woman who could have chosen any warrior in her camp had chosen instead to bring the last of a shameful bloodline to the place of its shame and stand beside him while he tried to set it right. You're awake, Yash murmured against his shoulder, well past midnight, thinking about the ritual. About you, Elijah admitted. About how strange it is that the worst thing my family ever did led me, eventually, to the best thing that ever happened to me. Yash was quiet a moment, her fingers tracing slow, idle patterns against his chest. My mother used to say that even broken things can be mended into something stronger than they were before, if the mending is done with enough care. I did not understand what she meant until now. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the dim starlight. Whatever happens at dawn, Elijah Monroe, know this. I do not regret a single day I spent finding excuses to keep you at my camp. Not one. Good, he said, drawing her back down against him, because I plan on giving you a lot more days to fill with excuses. They lay together until the sky began to gray toward dawn, and then rose, dressed in silence, and walked down to the ford together to finish what a dying shaman's curse had begun 30 years before. The ritual itself, as it turned out, needed no great show of magic, no dramatic flame or thundering voice from the heavens. It needed only what the old lore had promised. The two halves of the broken token, held by descendants of both sides bound not by duty but by true choice, brought together at the water's edge as the first light of dawn touched the ford. Yash drew both pieces from the leather satchel and pressed them into Elijah's hands, closing her own hands around his to hold them steady. "Together," she said. They knelt at the water's edge as the sky lightened above the ruined tower, and pressed the two halves of bronze together between their joined hands. For a long, breathless moment nothing happened at all, and Elijah felt a cold spike of fear that the lore had been wrong, that 30 years of pain would simply continue unbroken. Then the seam between the two halves began to glow, faint at first, like the last coal of a dying fire, and the light spread outward across the surface of the token until the broken circle shone whole and unbroken between their hands, the image of clasped hands around a full sun burning bright gold in the growing dawn light. A warmth passed through Elijah's palms, up his arms, through his chest, like a held breath finally released, and beside him he felt Yash go still, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and overwhelming relief. "It is done," she whispered. "Ancestors watch over us. It is actually done." The light faded slowly, leaving the token merely bronze once more, though whole now. The seam between the two halves fused seamlessly as if it had never been broken at all. The heaviness that had hung over the ford since the moment they arrived lifted with it, so gradually that Elijah only noticed its absence once it was entirely gone. The air around the ruined tower suddenly just air. The ground beneath them suddenly just ground, no longer haunted by 30 years of unfinished grief. Yash sat back on her heels at the water's edge and let out a long, shaking breath, and when she looked at Elijah her eyes were bright with unshed tears he had never once seen threaten to fall from her before. "Chief Scarn," she said, "if the lore held true his sickness, we won't know until we're home," Elijah said gently, "but Yash, look at this place. Feel it. Whatever else happened just now, this ground is at peace. That has to count for something." She reached for him then, pulling him into an embrace fierce enough to lift him half off his feet, and held him there at the water's edge with the whole risen sun spilling gold across the ford, murmuring something in her own tongue against his hair that he did not need translated to understand as gratitude, and relief, and love all tangled together into something too large for words in any language. They did not return to Ashroot Camp immediately. Threk Ironjaw, true to the promise buried in his own grudging respect, had ridden ahead of them on the return journey to carry word to the chief of what had happened at the ford, and by the time Elijah and Yash rode back down into the valley 8 days later, word had already spread through the whole camp. Chief Borak Skarn's wasting sickness had broken in the night, exactly at the hour the dawn light would have touched the ford, and the old chief was, for the first time in 30 years, sitting up and taking food with an appetite that astonished every healer who had long since given up hope of it. The camp that greeted them was a different place than the one that had gathered around the council fire in suspicion and anger only weeks before. Elders who had once eyed Elijah with open distrust now approached him to press small gifts into his hands, a carved bead, a strip of good leather, a bowl of the honeyed grain cakes usually reserved for celebration. Children who had once kept a wary distance now trailed after him asking, in halting human words Elijah had taught them himself, to see the mended token that had saved their chief. Even Threk Ironjaw, when he came to meet them at the stockade gate, offered Elijah something that was not quite friendship but was, at last, something like respect. "You walked into fire for this camp," Threk said gruffly, "twice over now. I misjudged how much of your ancestors' shame you were willing to carry to set it right. That was unfair of me." He held out a broad hand, the same gesture Elijah had once offered Yash on a bloody road and had it accepted with faint surprise. "I will not stand against your claim again, Cartwright. I'd rather be your friend than your rival if you'll have it," Elijah said, taking the offered hand. "Camp's better with 2 good captains than one, seems to me." Chief Borak Skarn received them both that evening at a feast held in their honor, sitting straighter and stronger than Elijah had ever seen him. Color returned to his face for the first time since the debt had first fallen upon his bloodline 30 years before. "You have done what I did not believe could be done in my lifetime," the chief said, addressing the whole gathered camp as much as the two of them. "You have completed a peace that was broken before either of you were born, and you have done it not through duty or command, but through love freely chosen between a human man and an orc woman who refused to let old blood dictate new hearts." He raised a cup toward them. "Ashroot Camp owes you both a debt greater than any curse. Name what you wish of us, and if it is within my power, it is yours." The whole camp fell silent, waiting, and Elijah felt Yash's hand find his beneath the table, gripping tight. "I do not want gold or land or titles, Chief Skarn," Yash said, standing to address her people directly. "I have spent my whole life as guard captain of this camp, and I do not regret a single year of it. But I have also found something in these past months I did not know I was searching for, and I find I am no longer content to spend my life only within these stockade walls, waiting for the next supply wagon to bring him back to me." She looked down at Elijah, and there was a question in her eyes even now, even after everything, as though she still needed to be certain of his answer before she said the rest aloud. "I wish to step down as captain and take the open road with him, not forever severed from this camp, for it will always be my home and my people, but free to come and go as we choose, tracking the wild country together the way he has always loved best, returning when the road brings us back and leaving again when it calls us onward." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, though it carried nothing of the suspicion from the council fire weeks before, only surprise, and beneath it, something that sounded almost like understanding. "You would give up your captaincy," Chief Skarn said slowly, "for a life on the open road with a Cartwright." "I would give up a great deal more than that," Yash said, "for a life with this particular Cartwright. I have led this camp's guard for 11 years, my chief. I have earned, I think, the right to choose what comes next for myself." The old chief studied her a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a rich, warm sound that seemed to shed another year of illness with every breath of it. 11 years of faithful service has indeed earned you that right, Captain Mudbourne, or Captain no longer, if that is your wish. Threk Ironjaw is more than capable of holding the guard in your stead, and I suspect," he added, glancing toward the second captain with a knowing look, "he will grow into the role well enough to make you proud of him." Threk, to his credit, only inclined his head, though Elijah caught the faint, pleased set of his jaw at the chief's words. "Go where the road calls you, both of you," Chief Skarn said, raising his cup again. "And know that Ashroot Camp's fires will always be lit for your return, whenever that may be." They left 3 days later at first light, with a single sturdy wagon Elijah had rebuilt from the broken one lost on the road so many months before. 2 new oxen the camp had gifted them in gratitude, and Yash's warhorse tethered behind for the stretches of road too rough for wheels. She had traded her captain's rank insignia for a simple traveling cloak lined with fur against the mountain cold, though beneath it she still wore the same fitted leathers she had worn the day she rode out of the tree line to save an ox and a fool Cartwright who had refused to abandon it, leathers that had seen a curse broken, a claim staked before a whole clan, and a love earned one extended stay at a time. They did not know, riding out from Ashroot Camp with the whole gathered clan waving them off from the stockade gate, exactly where the road would take them first. Whether it would be back through Fenwick Crossing to mend more fences with old Garrett Pell, and the rest of a town slowly learning to see past its fears, or further out into the deep wild Elijah had always loved best, tracking game and trading goods between whatever settlements and camps welcomed a human and an orc traveling together as equals. They did not need to know yet. That was, Elijah thought, watching Yash ride beside the wagon with the mountain wind pulling loose strands from her dark braid, and the rising sun catching the whole, unbroken bronze token she now wore at her own throat alongside his, rather the point of choosing the open road over the comfort of settled walls. "Regrets?" he asked her, as Ashroot Camp fell away behind them into the morning haze. "Only one," Yash said, guiding her horse close enough to reach over and take his hand as the wagon rolled on beneath them. "That I did not find an excuse to keep you that very first day on the road, instead of waiting for a second delivery to do it properly." "You kept finding excuses eventually," Elijah said, lacing his fingers through hers. "Kept extending my stay until I forgot I ever had anywhere else to be." "I intend to keep extending it," Yash Mudbourne said, low and warm and utterly certain. "For the rest of both our lives, Cartwright. Get used to staying." "Already have," Elijah said, and they rode on together into the wide, waiting country, two people who had started as strangers on opposite sides of an old and bitter line, and had chosen, in the end, to walk the rest of the road as one.